Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Vantage Points. I'm Hisham al-Maligi. Thank you for joining us. Sorry we had a little bit of technical difficulty, but we're going to get right into tonight's topic. As you might have heard the past couple of days, revelations about the Muslim app that is called Muslim Pro, one of the most popular Muslim apps for prayer times, recitation of the Quran, and many other uses. It's been alleged that the data, especially the movement and location data of the users, have been sold to a contractor of the US military, and is specifically a unit that is dealing with terrorism, counterterrorism. This app is mostly or started to be used by Muslims in the West, minority Muslims in the US, Canada, UK, France, and then it spread across the world. The founder of the app is a non-Muslim French citizen based in Singapore, and they issued a statement denying that this is happening or has happened, and still they terminated their relationship with their data companies that's handling their information. So all this brought back the discussion about how the US government views Muslims, deals with Muslims, and handle issues regarding Muslims. Because if the allegations are true, then the US government is basically could be spying on Muslims, not only overseas, but also within the United States. So without any further ado, I'm bringing tonight's guest, an expert, a legal expert, Mr. Harsha Panduranga. I hope I didn't butcher the name. He is the Liberty and National Security Program Counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law. So let me bring him in. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining me, Harsha.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. So, as you heard in the introduction, this issue is not new for Muslims. Even before the Snowden revelations about the metadata and spying on everyone, the NYPD was exposed to be spying on Muslims, not only within New York City, but outside of New York City as well. So I want to tackle the issue of countering violence extremism, CVE programs. What is it, how it started, how it evolved over the years, and its impact on, as you can see it, because you're the one who was studying this. So first of all, before we get into that, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then go ahead and explain the program.
Sure. So my name is Harsha. As was introduced, I'm a counsel in the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program. I started there about just about 3.5 years ago, around April 2017, and my work actually first started in the space related to the Muslim ban. And that had just happened about 3 months prior to that. And it was kind of as our work merged more into the immigration space, which had always been kind of a ground where national security issues were fought out, but it became increasingly so after the Trump administration. And I should say national security only in the sense that is a pretext in order to restrict immigration to the country. With respect to CVE, or what have been called countering violent extremism programs, one way you can think of them is they are to occupy the period of time prior to someone being the subject of a law enforcement investigation. So being, meeting the legal requirements, though they are very thin, meeting the legal requirements for being under the investigation by the FBI or whoever else. So the idea is to leverage or partner with community organizations, whether that means religious organizations, obviously particularly mosques or schools or nonprofits, to kind of essentially act as the eyes and ears of law enforcement to see if there are people that meet any of these what they call warning signs, or that look like they meet any of these warning signs that they might adopt a radical, so-called radical ideology, and go ahead and be at risk for committing a terrorist attack. So the idea is to just kind of map the space out from when someone is just a person, often a child, just in a community, up to the point where they interact with a range of institutions, and we see if they proceed along what the government calls a path to violence. The problem is that all of these kind of methodologies and predictive criteria that are used in order to make these kinds of assessments have no scientific basis at all. And you see that and the government has actually come to sort of recognize that it's more complicated. So initially, with these kind of CVE programs originating in New York with the NYPD, they had posited a pretty straightforward kind of path to radicalization, whereas a person would start attending mosque more, or grow a beard or whatever, and that somehow was considered a serious a sign that they might be starting to believe something radical, which is obviously ridiculous. But then, as the government did more studies, they started to realize, okay, well, we understand that radical thought is not a precursor to radical ideology, to violent action. And it could go in the other direction. It could not be a sequence. It depends on the ideology. So the last study that they did, actually examining this stuff, made a number of different qualifications about this process of radicalization. But for whatever reason, they seem keen to predicate further programs and research on this basic path. Now, I mentioned the issue with the problem that the factors aren't actually predictive. There's also, as applied, a lot of the factors, and I think I mentioned with the beard and going to mosque, a lot of the warning signs are actually signs of constitutionally protected activity, whether that means being able to go worship who you please, or whether it means being critical of the police, or being critical of U.S. foreign policy, which were also indicators in previous CVE programs that someone might be on the path to violence. And then of course, this concept of being radical in itself is a subjective concept, in the sense that most often, whenever there are kind of ideas or theories that challenge the established structures of power, those are the things that people call radical, whether that means the fight for civil rights, or the fight for women's suffrage, or whatever it might be. And then later, those end up becoming part of what we call mainstream thought.
So let's take a step back. Before the Associated Press revealed the NYPD spying documents that were leaked to them, the NYPD had relied on the RAND Corporation to develop a study for what is radicalization within the Muslim community. And I think you mentioned some of the characteristics that the RAND Corporation put in that report, that if a Muslim grows a beard, or prays 5 times a day, or stops smoking, or some ridiculous criteria that fits any Muslim in today's world, any practicing Muslim, and they considered this radicalization. So from there, was this the basis of the original CVE program?
I'm not absolutely sure about the particular RAND Corporation study, but what I can say is that the indicators are very common when it comes to CVE programs that have come out or emerged in the middle of the decade between 2010 and 2020. And the RAND Corporation, however, did do so. I think it's important for folks to know as a formally, speaking matter, the government doesn't call the program CVE anymore, right? Because there's a lot of public objection to it, of course, as people said this is kind of an excuse to surveil our communities. It's not really based in any solid science, and so it's obviously targeted Muslims. So we don't want this here. And so what the government has done is they have repositioned it to be called targeted violence and terrorism provisions. So they've broadened the frame to say we're actually going to be focusing on more things. But the RAND Corporation is the same the same organization that has sort of developed the study that now serves as the basis for this expansion. It's the main study that is cited in favor of it. In terms of the specific indicators, it's hard to tell because there's not as much information about kind of how the documents underlying the grants and the materials that are being used. But they have not, while they have changed the name, they have not disavowed any of the kind of basic tenets of CVE. So I wouldn't be surprised to see similar things working themselves in there, even if they're not as explicit as a religious practice.
So, for those who are not aware, can you explain what the program, regardless of its name, what it does? How does it impact people on the ground?
Yeah, so I would divide it into I suppose three major categories. I think the first two categories, however, are really going to be our focus. And you can kind of just accepting the model for radicalization that the government has put forth. These sort of different programs or different categories of interventions are supposed to work at different stages of the quote unquote radicalization process. So the earliest set of programs are kind of what folks called like awareness and resiliency programs. And what these do is that they're actually targeted at and they historically been targeted at Muslim communities, in particular Somali Americans and Iraqi Americans. And the idea is that children, and particularly children in those communities are going to have, a tough time, integrating into the broader society. So, and that actually is a, risk factor that they have identified for potentially becoming a terrorist or potentially finding these kind of radical philosophies appealing. And so what these early stage programs do is that they sort of, they're couched in the language of, kind of having these kids having like mentorship programs for the kids, connecting them with the cops so they become, more trusting of the cops, doing things like a school cleanup day or whatever it might be, just to kind of get them, more comfortable with the community. The early stage programs, they're still kind of problematic because they make a lot of assumptions about who is, prone to committing a terrorist violence and, who isn't, just because actually, far-right violence has killed more people in the United States since September 11th than anything associated with, quote-unquote radical Islam. But you don't see, those kinds of law enforcement framed efforts going out in the other communities. So there's a stigmatic component to that. The second kind of issue is that there is a close role for law enforcement in a lot of these programs. And so, even though the documents often contain really like boilerplate language about how civil rights and liberties are not going to be affected, whenever there is law enforcement involved, there's always the risk that, what's actually happening is they're, going to be looking for kids who they think might be vulnerable to radicalization.
So these programs are focused on Muslim kids?
Yeah, historically they have been, yes. And it's tough to tell what the current kind of posture of the programs is. I know that, and this is kind of an overarching point, but one thing to remember is that CVE is very much, or TVTP or whatever you want to call it, is very much going to be responsive to the current political movement and current political shifts. And recently there has been a little bit of, political rumbling that more needs to be done about far right or white supremacist violence. And that's reflected in the grants that were given as part of this recent cycle in fall. But that I think doesn't take away the potential dangers for discriminatory targeting, and it doesn't it doesn't fix the fundamental flaws of the program. But historically, obviously, the focus has been on Muslims. Yes.
So this is one of three different programs.
Yeah, categories of programs. The middle, and they overlap, but the middle is really um, kind of developing an infrastructure, whether that means implementing hotlines or creating what they call threat assessment teams to basically train people to pick up these kind of warning signs, right? The what we mentioned about feeling socially isolated and feeling disinterested in society and all that kind of stuff. Kind of training, whether it's folks at schools, whether it's folks at mosques or wherever, to kind of see if people fit into, they meet the checklist, and then potentially refer them to, whether it's law enforcement or whether it's social services. So it's kind of creating this pipeline from, wherever a kid or person might be functioning to, the next stage of resources. So that's the identification part.
This is very similar to a program in the UK, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I'm not as familiar with international programs, but I understand that I believe it was Prevent was what it was called.
Prevent.
Yes, which was a very controversial program, and I think was, for people operating in this world, my understanding is that it's not viewed as a particularly productive model. But
so what can go wrong in that second model?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of things, right? So I guess there's kind of two sides of the coin. In terms of the impacts on the people that are going to be affected, because the criteria are, not only do they cover kind of constitutionally protected activity, but they're also often very vague. Like if someone's feeling socially isolated, or they're kinds of things that are true of large segments of the population. And so what you do have is, when there's a broad kind of standard that you can use to warrant, flag someone as a potential threat, that is, a classic way for bias to seep into decision-making processes. So, just like it happens in the context of a traffic stop where you can pull someone over for a broken taillight, you can have a similar kind of situation where, there could be 100 kids that are isolated, but you just pick the one that fits your kind of stereotype of, what you think a terrorist looks like.
So in the program in the UK, the teachers at schools, Muslim or not, and majority is non-Muslim, of course, they are tasked with this, task to pick if they see someone who fits the criteria. And of course, the majority of the criteria, if not all of it, is focused on Muslim behavior. So it's basically creating spies on the Muslim community from within and without the community. Is that more or less a similar impact?
Yeah, I think that's correct. And I think that, whether or not the indicators are explicitly, tied to, Muslim religious practices, I think that risk still exists, because I think, for a lot of folks, their pre-existing profile of what, someone who looks like a terrorist is not necessarily going to be a white kid. But yes, there's obviously a danger to that. Now, well, I will say what the folks that are proponents of this program will say is that the teachers or the religious leaders or the community members are more closely situated to the students, so they they have a kind of, like, they're going to know better whether someone is going off the path or whether they're kind of just acting normally than maybe a police officer or FBI agent. I think the problem is that might be true, but I think the problem is that the indicators are so broad and so kind of vague that regardless if that's true, it doesn't really serve to anchor decision making in a kind of valuable way, in any sort of a way that's productive.
So that's from the productivity and efficacy of the program. What could happen to someone who is wrongly identified from the criteria? Someone who could not be a terrorist, someone who like doesn't think that way, but because of the vagueness of the criteria was reported as such.
Yeah, look, this is one of the fundamental problems is that it's antithetical to everything that, we think about when we think about living in a society that's governed by, rules and rule of law that protects everyone equally, right? Because if you are going to be called a terrorist, typically, and it's true that the criminal consequences are more severe, often people aren't going to jail in the context of CVE programs, although there are cases where, the FBI is involved. But typically there's a law. It states what activity is prohibited, why you have violated. The government gets to accuse you. You get to go in front of the judge or jury. They make their case, you make your case, and then they decide, right? Have they proven it beyond reasonable doubt? While the consequence in CVE programs is not jail, it might be something like social stigma. It might be something like getting kicked out of a school, whatever the case. Those kinds of mechanisms to ensure that you're getting a fair shake don't exist, and the kind of standards that you're being evaluated pursuant to are too broad for them to even meaningfully exist. So from the perspective of it being a fair and equal kind of treatment of folks, that's not really something you're getting out of the system.
Mm-hmm. So this is the second type of program. What's the third?
The third, which I think they raise a different set of concerns, and they haven't been as much the focus of my research as of yet, but it has to do with folks who are already have been incarcerated or in prison, and they're about to be released, or they're looking to be released, and these programs essentially have to do with trying to apply risk tools to determine, what's the chance that someone will reoffend or, I guess, re-radicalize into violent ideology. I think it's more, it's not as salient of a focus of policymakers in the United States as it is in maybe Europe, because I think in Europe you have a lot more folks who have gone to Iraq and fought for ISIL and then returned and are subject to maybe shorter prison sentences, and then they have to kind of figure out how to move forward.
So this is purely focused on the prison population.
In terms of what I would categorize as a late stage intervention, yeah, that's I believe that's really the primary primary focus there.
So who owns the CVE program, or its new name TPT?
Yeah, and if I may add, also there's one kind of, it's a category that really fits on the early side of things, but it's different in terms of the kinds of concerns that it implicates, and that has to do with the efforts on the internet. So the Department of Homeland Security, one of the kind of pillars of their TVTP CVE thing is they understand the internet to be a force that's accelerating radicalization and kind of connecting people to communities that they might not otherwise join. And so to that end, they do things like they have funded in their most recent round of grants a media literacy grant. They have been working with tech companies to take down what is called terrorist content, and there are all sorts of kind of again, kind of due process and methodological issues with that in terms of how well the companies are actually able to take down only the things that are appropriately taken down. Mm-hmm. But it is another focus of the government, and obviously that raises a specter of, if it's not done properly, censorship of political speech. Sorry, what was your question again?
So who owns the CVE programs?
Yeah, right now the CVE programs or TVTP, whatever you want to call them, are primarily run out of the Department of Homeland Security in the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. And so that office was created in, I believe it was April 2019. And basically the idea was that, the approach to CVE, the ownership of it was, or what they call terrorism prevention now, has sort of been fragmented and in different places throughout the federal government. So the idea of this Office of TVTP is to kind of consolidate it in the home of Department of Homeland Security.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk about the main fear behind the reason is claimed that these programs are necessary, which is radicalization or that leads to violence. Can we define radicalization? Is it a bad thing in and of itself?
Well, I mean, I think it's kind of like sort of a junk concept in the sense that it's the idea that someone has adopted a worldview that um, is one in which they find violence justifiable, and it's one in which they are prone to act on their violent intentions. Now, the problem is that it kind of eludes specific definition, as I kind of pointed out before. While the earlier theory said it's kind of easy, it goes like a conveyor belt, where basically, you feel aggrieved, and then you find a preacher, or you find something on the internet, and then you're like, okay, this actually fits my aggrievement narrative, and so I'm going to take it up, and then you become radicalized, and somehow you go and are going to go commit a terrorist attack. We know that's not how it works, but it does seem a little bit like the government is trying to squeeze a square peg in a round hole, in a sense, trying to make the process work to kind of anchor all their programs. But yeah, I mean, as I mentioned also, just because radical ideas are not necessarily a bad thing, and obviously violent philosophies are very devastating, very harmful. But in terms of who gets to decide what counts as violent and who gets to what side of the line that falls on, often when it's the government or traditional law enforcement institutions, they're going to be picking things that don't challenge their authority. Which you can kind of see, the prosecution or the FBI's attention to folks like animal rights activists and Black Lives Matter protesters and other folks who don't really pose a deadly threat, but they do pose a political threat.
And even environmental activists are also being targeted under the same programs, or like different programs, as if they are terrorists or prone to violence. Looking at let's take the example of the American forefathers. Wouldn't they be categorized as radical and violent extremists by the government at their time?
Yeah, probably, maybe even explicitly that way they were. I mean, yeah, that's exactly the point that I'm trying to make. Is I think that a lot of times things that end up sounding like common wisdom or just the right thing to do at once are the product of a challenge to the powers that be, and that's why it is a little bit dangerous to let the governing institutions kind of define what radical is and ban it. And that's kind of why we have First Amendment, right? And even the government's own materials will take pains to say that we're not criminalizing thought, we're not doing this. Well, you can write whatever you want in your policy document, but at the end of the day, what you're saying is that radical thought leads to radical violent action, which to me it sounds a little bit like criminalizing thought, but that is what they say. They understand, but they want to wedge their way around it.
Very good. We are speaking with Harsha Panduranga. He's a counsel at the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law. So the radicalization definition is, for example, or fundamentalism. If we take that example or that jargon, I would love to be treated by a fundamentalist physician, meaning someone who adheres to the fundamentals of medicine. Like I would like my car to be fixed by a fundamentalist mechanic, and so much so forth. So the fact that someone is radical is not a negative thing, is not a criminal thing in and of itself. There must be something else attached to that radical thought in order for it to be a criminal act, which is hurting, stealing, killing, something to that sort. But someone with just thinking radically, for example, the American electoral system, it needs a radical overhaul. We don't have a confirmed president 2 weeks after the elections. This is the United States of America. So if someone says we need a radical overhaul, that's not a bad thing in and of itself. The problem is the government CVE programs, or its new name, TBT, whatever, is criminalizing basically the thought itself. It's persecuting the intent, or like as putting words and deeds in the mouths and hands of individuals who did not commit a crime and might never commit a crime. Am I getting close to the?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's as simple as just whatever ideology you might have, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to commit any violent crime, even if it's an ideology that has violent elements. There has to be specific evidence that that's what you intend to do. Now, I do want to say, I think we can definitely say, that some ideologies are really bad. I completely agree with that. And I think, there are ideologies that are extremely hateful, that, advocate for killing, that do all of these things that are really bad. The main question for me is the reason that we have this kind of freedom of thought is that we don't want the government to be able to tell us which ones are good and which ones are bad. Because that's kind of, a decision that's going to be made based on the incentives that the kind of, the powerful folks might have, right?
So I volunteered with an organization called the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, and the chairman of the board, he's a lawyer, Steve Downs, coined the phrase preemptive prosecution to many of the so-called terrorism cases that were busted post 9/11, where either the FBI or some other government agency on the federal or local level sends an undercover individual, whether a citizen, a private citizen, or law enforcement, basically cooks a plot and then attach a gullible, person who would not have even thought to go that route unless the government sent someone to egg them on to do it.
Right.
From what you explained about the CVE programs, I'm seeing a correlation. Do you think, for example, such programs reached state and local levels and created this mentality that the Muslim mind is prone to violence against non-Muslims and against the United States, and therefore it's okay to criminalize their thought?
Interestingly, I don't agree with this, but what a proponent of CVE programs would say is that adding CVE to the equation actually reduces the chances that you'll have, kind of aggressive counterterrorism investigations run by law enforcement. And the reason for that is that there are less people that they are worried about as potential terrorists, because a lot of these people are going to be handled, by, the mosques or schools or whoever that, are tasked with administering CVE. So there's less of an incentive. They're not as worried about, getting one event wrong and then, being held accountable for it. I don't really agree with that, because how I see the system is that it's actually creating more, you know, potential points for people to come to the attention of law enforcement. Just because once you're flagged as suspicious, you know, that's not a thing that just kind of goes away. It's not a thing that someone says, oh, well, that's fine, we'll just keep an eye on him. You know, often folks are going to want to get law enforcement involved, and that's how you get to the kind of scenarios that you just described.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, that's concerning. It's a slightly separate issue, but it is, you know, obviously aggressive counterterrorism tactics that have been, you know, used historically by the FBI are also kind of a complementary problem to CVE.
And I also don't agree like you with this thesis, because I have seen myself that most cases when someone is trying to call for violence, it is usually someone sent by law enforcement to like incite someone to latch on. And I myself dealt with an NYPD informant who I threatened to call the police on him if he keeps on speaking like that. And I wasn't aware, of course, that he's an informant at the time.
Yeah.
Long story short, he basically, in my view, entrapped two young, gullible Muslim men in the famous Herald Square case. The arrest was made during the 2004 Republican National Convention in New York City. So those two young men were accused of attempting to detonate bombs in the Herald Square subway station under Macy's in 34th Street, or I forgot which street. So to the extent, actually, one of your colleagues, Martin Stoller, was the lawyer in this case. And I remember watching him on Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman, stating that even the backpack that the accused were supposed to put the explosives in were given to them by the informant.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah,
yeah. No, I mean, I agree. I think there's even a lot of cases where it's not even, you know, as nefarious sounding as that, right? Like where someone basically asks a kid potentially has, you know, kind of, you know, mental health issues or whatever, to convince him to mail a check to some, you know, organization that is categorized as a, you know, designated foreign terrorist organization, and that's enough to support a material support charge under the current laws. So, yeah, I think, you know, that's certainly a very problematic and common theme, and coupled with the use of informants is really, really damaging. It really does, you know, stigmatize kind of entire communities as prone to terrorism in a way that's entirely inappropriate and inconsistent with our values.
Right. So let's talk about the funding and how it goes, if you've looked into that. The funding comes from DHS and goes to states and cities, law enforcement, as well as private organizations. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So currently, the funding that has specifically been appropriated for TVTP in fiscal year 2020 amounts to $10 million for this grant program, of which the grants were just awarded in September to, I think it was 25 different grantees, maybe 29 different grantees, you know, which run the spectrum from, you know, police departments to sort of state security agencies to, you know, various nonprofits. And of course, you know, how it works is DHS will have the money, they will provide it to the winning grantees, and then sometimes the grantees will work with sub-grantees and subcontractors further, you know, further administer aspects of the program. We don't have a ton of details yet on in terms of this round on how that is kind of working, but we also do know that for fiscal year 2021, DHS has requested a doubling of funding for the grant program, so to make it $20 million, and then also an additional $60 million for various other items in support of it, including items that go to DHS's Office of Intelligence and Analysis to kind of streamline information, intelligence sharing between state and local governments. So and state and local governments and all the various kind of civil society actors that are swept into the TVTP program. So this, if there is one thing that's very clear, not only from the funding request, also the establishment of the office, it's pretty clear that they are trying to institutionalize this. They're trying to give this a home in the federal government, and one that is going to have staying power and going to be something that can be the subject of funding requests that won't be vulnerable to changes in administration or cycles.
So the money going to a government agency on any level, federal, state, or local, okay, I understand where the money is going and what they're going to do with it. Why are they giving the money to private organizations, not for profits?
Well, I mean, the entire idea, right, is that, or at least how TVTP is sold, is that it is an efforts that are going to be administered and that are going to be run and that are going to be private organizations that take the lead, because they and this is kind of in the core like concept underpinning the whole thing, and they reiterate, even though they don't behave in a way consistent with it, is that it's centered around community trust. So one of the big findings of this RAND report that set the foundation for TVTP is that you can't have community trust when it's the Department of Homeland Security that's coming into your communities, and with this crazy record on immigration enforcement and the profiling at airports and like whatever it might be, they're not going to be folks that people trust to report warning signs of their friends and family to, right? It's going to be the organizations that they know that provide services in the community, things like that. So by kind of running a grant program and letting private organizations run it, it's supposed to engender further trust for the program and make sure it's something that's rooted in the community as opposed to federally run out of Washington.
And of course, as any grant, the recipient must abide by certain rules and guidelines. And if it is that program, then we know that this organization that received that money is more or less advancing this policy of CVE TPT.
Yeah, look, I cannot, I can't speak for every single organization. And look, like it's true, a lot of the folks that are, participating in these efforts are very well-intentioned folks that, have the best kind of desires for their communities. So, it's a complicated picture. I think at least how I view, our role is just to kind of make folks aware of kind of the complications associated with working with DHS and the actual downstream consequences it can have.
I fully appreciate your role, and I'm not trying to make you say something against the organizations. I'm really interested in how you see, from your experience and your research, how these programs impacted individuals, recipients of services, or whatever they receive from such organizations.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I can't I can't speak to specific instances necessarily, but what I can say is that, look, when you're getting money from Department of Homeland Security, it's going to change your incentive structure, right? If you're getting 500 grand, 100 grand, whatever, you're going to want to not only comply with the conditions of the grant and make sure that you're effectuating it in a way that they want, but you might be more inclined to do things that the federal law enforcement asks, just because they're giving you money. That's how anyone would behave, right?
Right.
So in terms of changing the incentive structure, yeah, it is like it is a little bit concerning from that perspective. Right. Even if it's not a direct line of command that the government can say do this or don't do this.
Right. And can people like the general public find out the recipients of these grants?
Yeah, it's on DHS's website now. it's hard to tell, again, because of issues related to the subgrantees, because we don't have the grant applications themselves. It's hard to tell kind of the details in terms of, the full range of actors that are going to be involved. But the 29 organizations that have received grants are listed on DHS's website. So they have disclosed that. And I think that they disclosed that in response to frustration from the public that the participants were not disclosed earlier the first time around. But they have disclosed, they said that they would be proactive in the evaluation. They've disclosed very little. They haven't disclosed, again, the applications, haven't disclosed materials that we would need to have a full understanding of what's happening.
And to your knowledge, did any entity or individual foil such information?
I had heard some folks were planning to do it. We were actually planning to do it at the Brennan Center. I just haven't gotten around to actually making that happen. I do know that it's a matter of interest, but I'm not 100% sure. But nothing is outstanding that I know of is confirmed.
Got you. Okay, so now comparing we spoke. You mentioned three different types of programs or categories of programs that TPT advances, and the middle one was basically assigning watchers from within society to monitor behaviors, and if they see certain signs, then they report it to authorities, which is very similar to the Prevent program in England, which led to a major outcry throughout history, especially the past couple of decades post 9/11. I remember myself and many others in the Muslim community saying the Patriot Act will not be limited to Muslims. This is a violation of the Constitution. Wake up. And now we see how other categories of individuals are being targeted by the government. So what can we as society do? What is our role? How can we help your work in order to correct the path of the government in handling such things?
Yeah. I think, one of the, of course, major kind of things, maybe two things. The first is just generally generating awareness about, about these programs. To be honest, even when I first started studying these programs, it was like the language was so kind of general and the framing was so soft that it can be hard if you're not really deep and seeped in it to understand why CVE or this TVTP can be really damaging thing. So I think just generating awareness of kind of who it is historically targeted, why why it's problematic from the perspective of not treating people equally even when you're talking about the warning signs. I think generating awareness of that is really important. I think the other kind of risk is that often a response to CVE or to these kinds of programs is that, well, what if we want to use it on white supremacists, or what if we want to use it on far right violence? And while that's appealing, from the perspective of wanting to do something, which is this very serious problem, but just remember that it's still the decisions about who these programs target are still a subject of politics. And historically, the politics haven't worked out in a way where they're targeting the far right and white supremacists. So, any win that kind of leverages a kind of flawed foundation is going to be a short-lived win. I think that's something that folks would be it would be good to help make folks aware of.
And when you say targeting white supremacists, it's not just targeting them for their thought; it's targeting criminal activity. So
yeah.
That should be the focus, not the thought process.
Absolutely, yeah. I think whoever it is not productive to have, have a system that investigates ideology. It should be focused on violence. That said, it is important to understand, like the various like dimensions of ideological violence, because ideological violence is different. Terrorism is different than other kinds of violence. It is a kind of attack on broader society. It has impacts more than the individuals that it affects directly. And being able to sort of fudge the categories has led to obviously disproportionate focus on Muslims in September 11th. And so still having kind of a full accounting of where the government has focused its resources is still helpful.
So in the remaining few minutes, do you see other programs around in any government agency? So, for example, this revelation that the U.S. military is buying Muslim movement data. What do you think about that? Is that, if true, because it's being denied, but if that is true, is it a constitutional violation?
I'm sure it's true, by the way. It sounds like the kind of thing that they've been doing for a while, and we know for a fact that the Department of Homeland Security has been doing this, to assist with, I don't know if it's deportations, but immigration enforcement. This is a problem, right? It actually illustrates a big gap in our laws, and even the military context is different. But typically, the Supreme Court just decided in 2017 that a person's cell site location data, so the location data that's on their cell phone, was sensitive enough that it was protected by the Fourth Amendment, and the government would have to go, get a warrant in order to be able to get that information. Now, just because the laws allow the kind of purchase and sale of this data, there's a really kind of patchwork kind of regulatory setting right now. This unfortunately is permitted, even though it's like something that is bad. So I think that legal reform in the area is needed, in with respect to a kind of a comprehensive data privacy law that governs what can and can't be sold, and gives some people ownership over the data that belongs to them, or information that is revealing about them. And that's a bigger project, but it is certainly something that stories like this one expose.
Is there some sort of a resource for the Muslim and non-Muslim community to protect themselves? So, of course, getting more information and making yourself more educated on these issues is important. But what resources are available that you know of that could be helpful to the community?
I'm not exactly sure how to answer the question. Outside of outside of a lot of the work that's been done, and by kind of advocates across the country, I think, I'm not exactly sure what a great resource would be, but I don't know. I guess I wouldn't reflexively turn to cops to answer questions, but I think that that's not something that folks are necessarily doing anyway.
I understand. So, does the Brennan Center provide any legal representation to community members who are affected? How does the center deal with the cases?
Right. We don't usually provide direct legal representation. That would be done, I think, through legal aid and like different channels. We kind of are more focused on like the policy work. Trying to understand what these programs are about, and then kind of making that position felt, whether it's in city council or in Capitol Hill, and then bringing kind of cases that challenge the bigger policies, like the Muslim ban. We're also challenging another what we call an extreme vetting requirement, that everyone who's applying for U.S. visa turn over their social media handles, which of course is going to have specific impacts on Muslims, given the overt statements about ideological profiling and who's usually kept out because of bias.
Right.
but we don't typically deal with individual cases where people have been.
Understood. So just I'll mention this for the benefit of the viewers. Um, the City University of New York Law School has a program called CLEAR, which is an acronym for Creating Law Enforcement Accountability and Responsibility. They provide free legal representation, of course, the legal aid in case of a criminal matter, the Council on American Islamic Relations, they have staff attorneys to handle these issues, and other organizations. So if you have been approached by law enforcement, whether FBI or NYPD or whatever, it is highly, highly, highly advisable not to speak with law enforcement without proper legal representation. And you can communicate with CUNY Clear or the Council on American Islamic Relations for representation in these matters. All you need to do is to the officer or the agent, please give me your contacts and my lawyer will be in touch with you. Did I do justice to this part?
I think you did. You did way better than I did. So
thank you. Thank you very much. So any last closing thoughts?
No, not really. I mean, but well, okay, I guess I would say, despite the name, this CV is very much around, and it is becoming entrenched in the kind of federal government. Now, Joe Biden has promised to take a look at TVTP and end it, and then make sure that any program that emerges as its successor is the product of consultative process with community stakeholders. I think we are still kind of waiting to see how exactly that's going to play out. Just because folks' attention is spread 1,000 directions right now, and they had to make a lot of promises to a lot of folks. But we'll see. We'll see how that kind of progresses moving forward.
Excellent. Harsha Panduranga, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Harsha is the counsel at the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. I appreciate you coming to Vantage Points and sharing your experience and research, and looking forward to having you another time in the future to discuss these and other issues. I appreciate you coming. Thank you so much.
Yes, Ashram, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes tonight's episodes. There are hashtags and there is a hashtag. This is the hashtag. Good night, America.